I walked into the courthouse, clenching my folder of documents against my chest. My heart started racing when I saw her. Jessica was sitting on the other side of the room, showing off a baby bump that hadn't been there during our last hearing 2 months ago. My lawyer, Michael, nudged me lightly and whispered, "Stay calm. We were ready for this." I watched Jessica whisper something to her lawyer, Brandon, while she theatrically ran her hand over her belly, making sure the judge noticed. She was wearing a tight dress that highlighted her condition, along with the pearl necklace I had given her on our 2nd anniversary. Typical her, using one of my things at a moment like this. Judge Pearson adjusted his glasses and began, "We are here to finalize the divorce between Scott and Jessica Miller. I see there's a new circumstance to consider." Jessica smiled triumphantly as her lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, my client is 5 months pregnant and requests that the prenuptial agreement be reconsidered in light of this new family situation." Michael remained calm by my side. We had discussed this possibility for weeks after a mutual friend casually mentioned that Jessica was spreading rumors about a pregnancy. Her words always had hidden meanings. "Mr. Miller," the judge addressed me, "are you aware of your ex-wife's condition?" I could only nod, knowing Michael would handle that part. 3 years of marriage destroyed by betrayals, lies, and manipulations. And now, this final blow. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. "Your Honor," Michael said, rising calmly, "we acknowledge Mrs. Miller's pregnancy, but we question its relevance to our case, considering that my client and Mrs. Miller have been separated for 7 months. Jessica's face subtly changed. Her eyebrows furrowed for a moment before she resumed her calculated look of vulnerability. Brandon, her lawyer, appeared unprepared. "Your Honor, regardless of the separation period, the child deserves financial support from its father." "I completely agree," Michael replied, pulling a blue folder from his briefcase. "However, we have substantial reasons to believe that my client is not the biological father. We have records of texts, witnesses, and evidence that Mrs. Miller was involved with at least 2 other men during the time of conception." The judge frowned as he took the documents Michael handed him. We included screenshots of her social media with Tyler, her friend with whom she denied any romantic involvement. Photos of them together at a resort while she claimed to be on a business trip. Dates, locations, everything meticulously organized. Jessica whispered furiously to Brandon, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. She never expected that I'd keep all that evidence. In fact, she never thought I'd see through her lies while we were married. But after the second betrayal, I started documenting everything quietly, preparing for the inevitable. "Mrs. Miller," the judge said directly to Jessica, "these are serious charges against your credibility. Mr. Miller is presenting consistent evidence that you didn't have physical contact during the possible conception period. Do you have anything to refute this evidence?" Jessica nervously glanced at Brandon, who seemed to be rethinking his strategy. I recognized the exact moment she decided to double down. "Your Honor, I visited Scott at his apartment in January. We tried to reconcile." Her voice trembled just enough. At that moment, Michael presented my stamped passport and hotel records. "Your Honor, in January my client was at a conference in Tokyo for 2 weeks, including the date Mrs. Miller claims she visited his apartment." Silence filled the room. I saw Jessica's face go pale under her impeccable makeup. "Besides," Michael continued, "we have texts recovered from Mrs. Miller's cell phone to Mr. Tyler Davidson dated in February, in which she mentions her pregnancy and explicitly discusses paternity with him." The judge examined the messages, his expression hardening. Brandon tried to intervene, but he was clearly out of arguments. "Mrs. Miller, the court will order a paternity test immediately," declared the judge. "This evidence raises serious doubts about your claims." Jessica grabbed Brandon's arm, her eyes now filled not with tears, but with anger. Her entire act was falling apart fast. "This is a setup!" Jessica abruptly stood up, her voice echoing in the room. "Scott is faking evidence so he won't take responsibility." The judge banged his gavel. "Mrs. Miller, control yourself or you will be removed from the courtroom." She took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure, but her hands were trembling. For a moment, I recognized the Jessica I once knew, not the calculating woman presented in court, but someone who lost control when her plans failed. "Your Honor," she said, forcing a calmer tone, "I am under immense emotional stress. Scott abandoned me when I needed him most, and now he's trying to deny our child." Michael remained unfazed. "Your Honor, in addition to the evidence already presented, we have a confidential medical report confirming that my client underwent a vasectomy 2 years ago, a fact Mrs. Miller was well aware of." Jessica's face drained of color. She had either forgotten this crucial detail or assumed I would never mention something so personal in court. Brandon looked at her in disbelief, probably realizing that he'd been played by his own client. "I demand a recess," Jessica shouted, finally shedding tears. They weren't tears of sorrow, I recognized, but pure frustration. The judge, visibly irritated, granted a 15-minute recess. As the officers led everyone out, I saw Jessica running to the women's restroom, followed by Brandon with an angry expression. 3 weeks after the disastrous hearing, I received a call from my bank questioning unusual attempts to access my accounts. Someone had tried to reset my passwords using personal information. The pattern was clear: Jessica's mother's birth date, the name of her first dog, and her graduation date. All details only Jessica would know. "Mr. Miller, we managed to block the attempts, but we recommend filing a police report," the manager suggested. That same day, my brother sent me a text. "Dude, Jessica just called me saying that you're in serious financial trouble and need money urgently, but you're too proud to ask." 2 days later, colleagues at work mentioned strange rumors about me facing lawsuits over debts. A quick credit check revealed 3 recent inquiries for loans in my name. Michael acted quickly, sending formal notices to Jessica. She replied via text, "You ruined my life. Don't think I'll just accept it and move on. I know things about you that could destroy your career." The following week, my boss called me into his office, concerned about an anonymous email alleging inappropriate behavior on my part. Fortunately, he knew my character and was aware of the situation with Jessica. The escalation continued when a court official knocked on my door with a document claiming a $15,000 loan that I supposedly had made to Jessica. The signature on the contract was obviously forged, as later confirmed by an expert hired by Michael. Jessica's attempts became more and more desperate, and paradoxically, every new move only strengthened my case against her. The phone rang at 5 in the morning. It was Michael. "Scott, we need to talk now." Jessica crossed a dangerous line. I sat on my bed, still groggy. "What happened?" "She forged a loan document for $75,000 with your signature as a guarantor. The bank contacted me for verification because something seemed off." I rubbed my face, trying to fully wake up. "How did she manage to get my signature?" "Apparently she used documents from our old joint life insurance. But the bank's handwriting expert noticed inconsistencies. Worst of all, she tried to use the document to withdraw money yesterday." I got up, now completely awake. Jessica's desperation was escalating to criminal levels. First, the attempts to access my accounts, then the false rumors among friends and colleagues, and now forging financial documents. "What are our options?" I asked, walking to the window. The day hadn't even fully broken yet. "The bank is willing not to involve the police immediately if we file a civil suit against her. But honestly, Scott, this might already be handled as a criminal case." I sighed deeply. I never wanted to see Jessica go to jail, despite everything. We shared 3 years of life. There were good times in between all the manipulations and lies. Part of me still cared about her and the child she was carrying, even if the baby wasn't mine. "Let's go with the civil suit for now. But I want protective measures for my accounts and a formal notification warning that any new attempt will be treated as a criminal offense." 3 days later, Michael called me again. Jessica had contacted 5 of my main clients, claiming that I had committed fraud on their projects. 2 clients had already canceled contracts. What intrigued me even more: how did Jessica know who my clients were? Then it hit me. My old laptop, which had been missing for months. It must have disappeared during one of her last visits to collect things from the house we used to share. That night, I found an envelope on my car's windshield. Inside were photos of me coming and going from the house, at the cafe near the office, even talking with my new assistant. Along with it, a handwritten note. "Still think you can get away from me that easily? I know everything about your life. $100,000 transferred to the account below will put an end to this once and for all." Michael recommended installing security cameras and filing a report for extortion. Detective Reynolds, a middle-aged man with a tired look, listened carefully to my story as he took notes. "This happens more often than you'd think," he commented. "Divorces can turn normal people into unrecognizable strangers. But Jessica was never normal. Now I could see the patterns from the very start of our relationship. The little manipulations, the victimization episodes, the way she gradually isolated me from friends who questioned her. The coincidences in which people she didn't like ended up having problems at work or in their relationships. The detective suggested that I gather witness statements about Jessica's behavior. Michael agreed, and we started putting together a detailed dossier. Former mutual friends, her co-workers, even her ex-therapist who agreed to testify after Jessica tried to ruin his professional reputation, provided statements. When we filed a formal extortion complaint, Jessica sent a message to my mom. "Your son is lying to you. He abused me several times during our marriage. I have evidence. Ask him about June 14th of last year." My mom, initially worried, called immediately. On the day Jessica mentioned, I was with my parents at my dad's 70th birthday, surrounded by dozens of witnesses, including Jessica herself. "She's creating false memories, son," my mom said, now completely convinced of Jessica's instability. "We need to protect you." The hearing for the document forgery and extortion case was set for a rainy Thursday. The courtroom was almost empty as we entered, with only a few lawyers waiting for other cases, talking quietly. Jessica arrived late, now with a prominent 7-month baby bump. She had dumped Brandon, apparently due to strategic differences, and was now represented by a younger lawyer named Gerald. Judge Peterson, different from Judge Pearson of the divorce hearing, was known for his strictness in fraud cases. He reviewed the documents with a grave expression. "Counsel, this case brings extremely serious charges: forgery of financial documents, attempted extortion, slander, and stalking." He looked directly at Jessica. "Mrs. Miller, do you understand the gravity of these charges?" Gerald quickly stood up. "Your Honor, my client strongly denies all charges. We believe this is a case of harassment by Mr. Miller, who couldn't accept the end of the marriage." Michael remained steady. "Your Honor, we are presenting substantial documentary evidence for every charge, including the bank's graphology report confirming the forgery, phone records of threatening calls, testimonies from clients contacted by Mrs. Miller, and photos with the extortion note, whose fingerprints have been confirmed to belong to the defendant." The judge flipped through the documents, pausing occasionally to read more carefully. Jessica was whispering angrily to Gerald, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Miller," the judge finally said, "the court is particularly concerned with the pattern of behavior shown here. You not only tried to defraud the legal system with false claims about paternity, but you also carried on with a systematic campaign of harassment and financial fraud." Jessica interrupted, her voice trembling. "Your Honor, I'm pregnant and vulnerable. Scott is trying to leave me helpless." The judge raised his hand. "Mrs. Miller, the court is fully aware of your condition. However, that does not exempt you from responsibility for clearly premeditated and calculated actions." After 3 hours of presenting evidence, the judge announced his decision. "This court finds that Mrs. Jessica Miller has violated multiple civil laws and possibly criminal statutes. I grant the restraining order requested by Mr. Miller, prohibiting any direct or indirect contact. Additionally, Mrs. Miller shall pay $45,000 in damages for the financial harm inflicted on Mr. Miller's business, plus legal fees amounting to $12,800. Jessica's face turned into a mask of disbelief. "I don't have that money. I'm unemployed and pregnant." "That should have been considered before you took these actions," the judge replied coldly. "Furthermore, I am forwarding this case to the district attorney for possible criminal charges for the forgery of bank documents and attempted fraud." Gerald tried to argue for a reduction in damages, but the judge was unyielding. When we left the courthouse, Jessica glared at me with palpable hatred. "It's not over," she whispered as she passed by me. Michael smiled faintly. "Actually, it is over. Any new contact will be a violation of the court order, resulting in immediate arrest." In the following weeks, I received calls from creditors seeking Jessica. Apparently, she had accrued significant debts in recent months. Her apartment was evicted for non-payment. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that Tyler, the likely father of the child, had moved to another state, denying any responsibility. The district attorney offered a plea deal. Jessica would avoid jail if she completed 300 hours of community service, underwent mandatory psychological treatment, and fully repaid the amounts she had tried to defraud. To my surprise, she accepted the deal, apparently finally understanding how serious her situation was. For a brief moment, I felt a bit of relief. Maybe now we could all move on. I was completely mistaken. On a cold October morning, while I was getting ready for an important meeting with investors, I heard firm knocks at the door. A court officer delivered an official document. Jessica had filed for an emergency restraining order against me, claiming death threats and intimidating behavior. According to the document, I had shown up at her new place, an address I didn't even know, yelling threats, followed her to her temporary job, and sent threatening messages from unknown numbers. My first reaction was to laugh incredulously. It was so absurd it seemed like a tasteless joke. I immediately called Michael. "It's a desperate move," he explained after reviewing the documents. She's flipping the situation to make herself look like the victim. The preliminary hearing is scheduled for tomorrow. We'll need to prove that you couldn't have done these things. We quickly compiled evidence. Security camera footage from my house showing I was home at the time she claimed I threatened her. Cell phone records indicating my location. Witnesses who were with me during business meetings when I supposedly followed her. And screenshots from my phone showing there were no records of the threatening messages she claimed. Judge Walker, a woman with a stern expression, listened attentively to Jessica's claims. She described in detail how I supposedly followed her, how my presence made her fear for her life and the safety of her unborn baby. I have nightmares every night, she declared, deliberately letting tears roll down. I can't work, I can't sleep. He won't accept that it's over and wants to harm me. When Gerald presented his evidence, screenshots of threatening messages and blurry photos of someone vaguely resembling me near her supposed workplace, I got chills. The forgery was sophisticated. Then Michael began our defense. Methodically, he dismantled every accusation. The threatening messages came from an app that allowed anonymous texts. We traced the purchase of its premium version to Jessica's credit card. The blurry photos had altered metadata, but forensic analysis revealed digital edits. And the most compelling, continuous security recordings from my home and office proved that it was physically impossible for me to be at the alleged locations. Your Honor, Michael concluded, not only are the allegations false, they constitute deliberate perjury before this court. Mrs. Miller is already answering for forgery and attempted fraud. This is just the latest episode in a systematic campaign of harassment and defamation against my client. Judge Walker carefully examined all the evidence from both sides. Jessica maintained a confident expression, occasionally touching her belly to emphasize her vulnerable condition. This court takes allegations of threats and intimidation very seriously, the judge began, especially when it involves a pregnant woman. However, she paused significantly. The credibility of the petitioner is seriously compromised not only by her previous cases, but also by the poor quality of the evidence presented today. Jessica started to protest but was silenced by the judge. In addition to denying the restraining order due to a lack of consistent evidence, this court will forward the case to the district attorney for investigation of possible perjury and evidence tampering. Mrs. Miller, you are playing with the judicial system, and this court will not tolerate such behavior. Gerald, looking defeated, quickly gathered his documents. Jessica remained seated, unmoving, as the hearing was adjourned. When she finally stood up, our eyes met. There were no more strategic tears or theatrical indignation, only a cold, calculated hatred that revealed who she truly was. As we left the courtroom, Michael put his hand on my shoulder. That was probably her final move in the legal arena. Now she's out of options. Unfortunately, desperate people with no legal options often resort to even more extreme measures. In the following weeks, an unsettling silence followed. Jessica seemed to have completely disappeared. No new accusations, no attempts at contact. I slowly started regaining a sense of normalcy. The clients who had left due to the rumors began coming back. I even started therapy sessions to process the psychological trauma of the past few months. I even allowed myself a first casual date with Claire, an architect I had met on a collaborative project. Normality finally seemed within reach. Until one night at 11:42 p.m. in November, my phone rang. An unknown number. Normally I would have ignored it, but something told me to pick up. Scott? Jessica's voice was unrecognizable. Hoarse, choked up. I need your help. I fell silent, my heart racing instantly. I know I don't deserve anything from you, she continued, her voice breaking, but I'm desperate. The rent, the medical bills, I have nowhere to go. Tyler disappeared completely. My parents aren't answering my calls. I'm about to have the baby and I have nothing. I took a deep breath. Jessica, we can't have any contact. There's a court order. Please, she pleaded, her arrogance completely gone. I just need a loan. I'll pay you back once I get a job after the birth. I've been sleeping in my car for 3 days. Part of me wanted to help. Despite everything, I couldn't imagine a pregnant woman being homeless. But years of manipulation had taught me the most important lesson. Jessica always twisted reality to suit her goals. I can't send you money, I answered firmly. But I can contact social services to help you. There are shelters for women in your situation. Shelters? She shouted, her tone instantly shifting to anger. You ruined my life and you offer me a shelter? I'm entitled to half of everything you have. Jessica, the divorce is final. The prenuptial agreement stands. There's nothing left to discuss legally. You're going to regret this, she hissed before hanging up. The next morning, I received a notification from the bank about suspicious activity. Someone had tried to use my social security number to open new credit accounts at 3 different institutions. The bank's security manager informed me that the person had presented convincing documents, including a forged power of attorney. 2 days later, my sister called me, confused. "Scott, why is Jessica asking for loans in your name from everyone in our family? She even reached out to Grandma saying you're in legal trouble and need money for bail." Before I could properly respond, the police showed up at my door. An investigation into fraud had been opened after Jessica used my information to buy a car on finance and issued bad checks in my name. Detective Ramirez, a specialist in financial crimes, sat in my living room reviewing the mountain of evidence Michael and I had gathered about Jessica's behavior. "This is much graver than we initially thought," he concluded. "We're talking about multiple bank frauds, forgery of federal documents, identity theft, and misuse of your social security number. Your ex-wife could face a significant prison sentence." I felt a tightening in my chest. "And the baby? If she's convicted, there are programs for incarcerated mothers to have visitation rights for a limited time, or the child may stay with relatives or be placed for temporary adoption." The reality hit me hard. Jessica had crossed all imaginable limits and would now face consequences that affected not only her, but an innocent child. 3 days later, Detective Ramirez called me. Jessica had been arrested trying to withdraw money with bad checks in my name. In her car, the police found a real forgery kit: stamps, blank documents, a portable printer, and personal data of several other victims besides me. "Mr. Miller, we found evidence that your ex-wife was planning similar frauds against at least 7 other people, mostly former co-workers and old friends. This has turned into a much larger investigation." Jessica was charged with 28 different counts of fraud, forgery, and identity theft. Her bail was denied due to her flight risk and her pattern of criminal behavior. The birth took place under custody, and the child, a girl, was temporarily placed in the care of Jessica's parents, who finally intervened upon realizing the gravity of the situation. I tried to feel a sense of satisfaction with justice served, but there was an overwhelming emptiness and sadness for the destruction Jessica had caused in her own life and in the life of an innocent child. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. On the day of Jessica's trial, I chose not to show up. Michael would represent me as needed, but I didn't need to personally testify about the end of that story. Instead, I spent the day completely reorganizing my apartment. I removed the last remnants of our shared life. Old photos stored away in a box at the back of the closet, gifts I never had the courage to throw away, even the movies we used to watch together. Some items I donated, others I discarded, and a few I kept as a reminder of lessons learned the hard way. Jessica eventually accepted a plea deal with the district attorney, pleading guilty to 11 of the 28 charges. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 years, along with financial restitution to the victims and mandatory psychological treatment. The judge took into account her recent pregnancy and the potential for rehabilitation in his sentence. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset, while Michael updated me over the phone about the details of the plea agreement. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, reflecting on the lost years and the emotional scars I still carried. I finally understood the full pattern of psychological manipulation I had endured during our relationship. Jessica wasn't simply a difficult person or an unfaithful partner. She showed traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and sociopathic behavior, as my therapist had carefully suggested during our sessions. The signs were always there: the ability to switch instantly between irresistible charm and calculated cruelty, the way she isolated me from friends who questioned her, how any criticism, however slight, triggered disproportionate retaliation, the way she constantly rewrote the story of our relationship, making me doubt my own memories and perceptions. Gaslighting, the term my therapist Dr. Elisa finally taught me. The systematic manipulation that made me question my own sanity and judgment. How long had I believed I was just being overly jealous, paranoid, or controlling, when in reality, I was simply spotting real lies? Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this.